They said, "Fly out, Grandma. We want you here for Thanksgiving." I packed my heart into a soft suitcase and boarded the red eye, thinking I was carrying nothing but a chipped mug and an old mason jar of coins. I did not know I was carrying the last pieces of a life they would soon try to erase. I arrived 10 hours later, the airport lights still yawning when I stepped into the taxi. The air smelled of exhaust and hotel soap, and a memory I could not put my finger on. My mother's perfume, perhaps, or the dust of a house I had not walked into for 2 years. I had not eaten much on the plane. My hands trembled with a small, habitual hunger. I held my pearls in the pocket of my coat because there are things a woman keeps close, even when nobody asks her to. They were not the sort of pearls you see in magazines. They were the pearls my husband once gave me on a bitter March when the bread was thin and our promises were thick. I had kept them in a tin with a chipped mug for 3 decades, a kind of shrine to ordinary endurance. Their house, my daughter's house now, rose like a poem I had once written and forgotten. Marble steps, a lantern that could have lit 1,000 misremembered dinners, a driveway wide enough for regret to turn around in. They had sent me a printed invitation, the sort you send when you want a memory to feel like a production rather than a reunion. "Please join us. Thanksgiving, November 26th, it read in careful script. They had underlined "join us" twice. I knocked. The door opened to a woman I recognized. It was my daughter in profile, but it was not her. She looked at me like a stranger had knocked on the wrong house, like a guest had arrived who had been invited by mistake. "Oh, Grandma," she said, and there was a tilt to her voice, a measuring that set my teeth on edge. It was polite, but it was polite at a distance. It was the politeness of someone who has rehearsed an emotion. She ushered me in with precise hands. The foyer smelled of cinnamon and something metallic, like the tang of keys that had turned too often in locks. I set my suitcase down and walked through rooms that were familiar in the way that portraits are, faces I knew, arranged now in wealth. Family portraits hung with glass that did not cloud. My own face reflected back to me thinner, with more lines, with the mason jar patience time had given me. I found the chipped mug. I had brought it like an offering and set it on a counter that hummed with quiet approval. She watched me set it down as if testing whether the mug would crack. We talk in small, careful sentences at first. She asks about my trip, about the plane. She offers tea that tastes of brand and not of something I used to brew in a cast pot and sip while mending socks. "We've remodeled," she says. "You'll have a room downstairs." Her eyes glance past me, toward a hallway where a maid hovers like a punctuation mark. Always present, never a sentence. Her husband, my son-in-law by marriage and boardroom manners, appears with a name tag of charm. He offers me a chair, an accommodation dressed as affection. I should have read the air then. I should have listened to the silence between their words. But some habits die slowly. I have raised children to be polite. I have taught them that the right fork is important and that the world is kinder when you smile through hunger. So I smiled. I said, "Thank you." I adjusted the pearls in my pocket like a woman checking her pulse. It began small, as these things often do. The first sign was an invitation for family photos that I received at the breakfast table on the second morning, a thin card slipped under a napkin. "Come to the library at 2 p.m., it read. I dressed in the only dress I had that still remembered my waist and hurried down the marble corridor. When I reached the library, it was already full of bodies that had teeth in their smiles and cold in their eyes. The family photographers, 2 people with perfect posture, gave instructions that were more like commands. "Stand here, chin up, smile." They positioned me by the fireplace as if I were a prop the house had always had. Someone whispered to my daughter about lighting and angles. Someone whispered my name and then forgot it. The photographer clicked and clicked, and the camera made that indifferent noise like a clock that had decided to keep perfect time even while the room's heart stuttered. I began to feel small in a way that is more dangerous than pain. It is the feeling of being invisible in plain sight. A week before their gala, for they had a charity gala every Q. December, and the house was already preparing with floral arrangements that smelled like money. I noticed a letter half slid under the study door. It was addressed to Estates and Affairs and bore the scrawl of a legal firm I had once trusted, Harrow and Finch. My fingers found it before my mind did. I stood in the hallway, the paper thin and significant in my hands. There was a stamp, August 12th, 2024. Inside I found forms, not for me, thank God, but for the estate, a mention of durable power of attorney, a list of assets, and the name of an attorney who had once shaken my hand with a respectable grip. The sum caught my breath, about $230,000 in a retirement fund, an equity interest listed for a townhouse in the city, a line referencing personal effects, language so clinical it hurt. I tucked the paper into my coat, more because I did not know what else to do with it than out of any plan. My daughter noticed me holding something and asked casually, "Everything all right, Mother?" Her voice was syrup trying to pass for honey. I said yes because what did I know? What could an old woman know of ledgers and trusts? That night, I sat by the kitchen window and wrapped my hands around the chipped mug as if heat could become armor. The mason jar, the jar we used when coins were prayers, sat on a shelf in the pantry, quietly bearing witness. I remembered a winter when my husband had left half his coat at the door for a stranger in need. I remembered kneading bread until my fingers trembled and promising my daughter a world. Had those promises been a ledger entry somewhere, recorded and converted into something sharp and valuable? The room was full of laughter from the dining hall like water leaking through plaster. Warm, loud and dishonest. My daughter told me in the middle of dessert one evening about an elderly neighbor who had been taken advantage of by a caretaker. "We just want to make sure it doesn't happen to you," she said. And there it was. The phrase that begins a kind of theft more devastating than money. "We just want to protect you." I froze for a second, the fork halfway to my mouth. Protect me from what? From me? From my own crooked spine? They offered to take my bank card and keep it in a safe place for emergencies. I laughed it off. Who would steal from an old woman? I kept the mason jar out of habit, slipping coins in when I thought nobody was watching. They noticed and smiled like people who think they have won a miniature war. Then the calls began. There were calls from people with polite voices who used the word arrangements as if it were currency and produced forms that needed signatures. On October 3rd at 11:15 a.m., a representative from Harrow and Finch called to confirm an appointment, a meeting about updating beneficiary information. "Just a routine review," the man said. There was a pause that smelled like a trap. I asked my daughter about it. She said, "Oh, that's simply paperwork, Mother. You can come by if you like, but it's really not necessary. We can handle it. They told me they would handle it. I should have been angry then." Instead, I was placated with a plate of pumpkin pie and an escort to a guest room that felt like a stage dressing. The house hummed with the friction of people who had learned to speak in calculated kindness. The maid, the punctuation mark again, brought fresh towels and a card that read, "Welcome, Grandma." The card was neatly printed and utterly hollow. There are moments when a life changes direction, and you do not notice until you have already taken the road. For me, one of those moments was when the bank called to ask whether I had set up a durable power of attorney. "Do you have?" The woman asked on October 15th at 2:02 p.m. I told her I had not. "It is wise," she said, with that same soft voice, "to have documentation in the event of incapacity." They used the same gentle panic that doctors use to sell tests. Later that evening, my daughter spoke to me of conveniences and ease and the word trust, like a lit candle being placed between us. She suggested casually that I visit Harrow and Finch again. They would help me fill out a durable power of attorney so that my financial affairs could be managed without inconvenience. Why did I trust her? Perhaps because my hands still remembered how to knit a sweater for a child who would grow chestnut hair and could not hold his spoon. Perhaps because the fear of being a burden is a humility that, for some of us, becomes a habit. I told her I would think about it. I tucked the mason jar behind a bread box and slept. A small sound woke me in the night, the hush of paper being handled. I opened my door and the hallway was a quiet river of slippers. My daughter's door was closed. I placed my ear to the wood and heard voices, low, careful, like two surgeons whispering. I could not make out the words, but I heard beneficiary and update float like feathers. My throat tightened so much I could taste the metal of my disbelief. I went back to bed and pretended to sleep, Pretending is a consolation prize we give ourselves when shame visits. A week later, on October 29th at 4 p.m., while my daughter was rehearsing a speech for a board she chaired, I found a paper in the guest room, a pamphlet for elder care planning, with a list of services and a checkbox marked durable power of attorney recommended. Someone had left it neatly on the nightstand as if to say, without cruelty or warmth, see, it is sensible. I folded the pamphlet and hid it in the seam of my suitcase. The mason jar felt heavier on the shelf. I will confess something plainly. There were moments when I thought I was imagining a pattern out of paranoia. The mind is a clever tailor. It can make a suspicion into a garment that fits too well. But then the small cruelties began to knit together into a pattern you could not ignore. Invitations were phrased in ways that excluded me from decision-making. Family photos were taken in which I was placed at the corner, like an afterthought composition. My name was spoken without the inflection of intimacy. It was uttered in boardroom tones, as if they were discussing an asset. Once, someone called me the elderly relative in a sentence meant for a house staff WhatsApp group. I saw the message when a maid left her phone near the sink. I pressed my thumb to the glass as if I could find the warmth of recognition there. They had begun the gentle erasure. I began to collect small proofs. On November 3rd, I found, folded into the pages of a book in the study, a copy of an advance directive with a signature that could have been mine if I squinted. There was a date, July 21st, 2024, and a note, client prefers grandchildren be primary visitors. I touched the paper like a woman touching the face of someone she once loved. I remembered the way my daughter used to laugh when her shoes were untied. I remembered bandaged knees and lullabies. I remembered lending my last $20 so she could finish a course. Had those memories all been converted to legalese and stored in the drawers of this house like linens to be used once and discarded? Why would they need such documents? I asked myself aloud, and the house answered with silence. I tucked my treasures, the pamphlet, the Harrow and Finch letter, the advance directive, into my own locked box that I keep hidden under the false bottom of a drawer in the guest room dresser. I placed the mason jar and the pearls on top. I was not ready to fight. Yet. There is a way to gather small, secret things that feels like planting bulbs for spring. The first micro cliffhanger arrives like a soft, sharp note. I found a name I did not expect. I almost did not go to the Thanksgiving rehearsal. I almost stayed in the guest room and let the house arrange my place like a napkin on a table. But pride is a strange currency. On the morning of the rehearsal, I walked into the kitchen and found a yellow envelope sticking out of the recipe book, addressed not to me but to Estates and Affairs. Inside, a single line had been underlined. Transfer of personal effects to beneficiary upon demonstration of incapacity. Under it was a lawyer's stamp and the initials JR, the same initials that appeared on an email I had once seen on my daughter's phone. J. Redding, a name unfamiliar to me, a name which did not belong to any branch of our family tree. I ran my fingers over the paper until they stung. I will say, simply and with the old stubbornness of my blood. The moment one finds a strange name in the ledger of one's life, one cannot pretend thereafter that the ship is not listing. I remember my husband used to say, when a man hides his hand, he thinks he hides his heart. How foolish men are to think their hands can hide anything from the slow, clever world of women who have lived long. That day, I did not tell my daughter I had found the name. I did not say anything. I wrapped my pearls in my handkerchief and went down to sit with the others. There is a kind of rage that cooks quietly, as patient as the yeast that makes bread rise. It is not always dramatic. Often it is domestic, a heat in the hands, a clarity in the eyes. I felt that heat then, like a saucepan warming on a flame. My heart felt like a watch that had been wound too tightly. Dumas would have called it divine providence. I call it the building of a resolve, I said softly, as though to myself and to the old mason jar watching from its shelf. If they mean to move me on like a piece of furniture, then they will have to learn how proud a piece of furniture can be. A moral aside, whispered as if from the high balcony of an opera house. When the hand that once fed you becomes the hand that hides, you must learn which hands are trustworthy and which are gloves worn for the taking. I did not yet know how the plot would develop. I only knew the first beats: a name, a stamped letter, a pamphlet, a photographer who positioned me like a relic. The house was a beautiful machine, and I was suddenly aware I might be only one of its moving parts. Replaceable, polished, and then stored away. I had one small advantage. I was a woman who had never learned to rely on polite assurances. I had raised children in a kitchen that taught me how to keep accounts by feeling. I had buried losses in mason jars and found them later with coins still warm. I had pearls that knew the weight of promises, so I began to watch. And that is where I stand at the end of this first act, with my suitcase half packed, the mason jar and pearls hidden, and a paper with a stranger's initials in my hand. The house continues its polite noise, laughter, silverware, the rustle of napkins like soft flags. My daughter smiles in a way that has a space in it, like a clock missing a hand. I never expected what I would find in that drawer. They laughed in the dining room that night, as if laughter could stitch a wound closed. I smiled with them and kept my hands folded so they wouldn't see them trembling. The mason jar on its shelf watched me like a small jury. I had learned to move like a woman who hid her plans in plain sight, quiet, deliberate, and patient as yeast. Rosa, the maid who had a way of humming when she washed the silver, became my small, brave ally. She came to me one afternoon when the house breathed the heavy warmth of people who think wealth is armor. "You don't belong to them," she told me, while folding towels, her voice small as the coins in my jar. She was from a town where people kept promises like bread. She had seen enough unkept ones in this house to be suspicious. That day, November 29th at 2:40 p.m., she slipped a scrap of paper into my hand, a torn printout of an email header that read, "From J. Redding at crimsonadvisors.com. Subject, finalize personal effects transfer. File, M. Langley. Date, 2024-11-12. The key, edges were ragged as if someone had been too hurried to care. Rosa told me she had seen things. He comes most mornings, ma'am. Mr. Redding. He brings folders. He sits in the study until late. He says things into the phone that make the house quieter, not less alive." She looked at me the way a child looks at an adult about to do something dangerous. "If you need papers, I can get them from the printer. I take out the trash at night." She dropped the words like pebbles into my lap. I had been a woman of small-town habits for a long time. Hide the good sugar to keep it from kids who will sneak. Count the silver, mend the tear before night. So when Rosa offered a small theft of truth, I accepted it as if borrowing sunlight. That evening, while the family rehearsed toasts in the drawing room, Rosa fetched a page from the trash behind the study printer and pressed it into my palm like contraband. It was a copy, not the sturdiest evidence perhaps, yet still a thread. It contained an email from J. Redding to Marcus Finch at Harrow and Finch. Finalize amendment to the trust. Ensure personal effects and personal property be transferred to me in trust upon demonstration of incapacity. Coordinate with Dr. Larkin for a certificate. The words were clinical and cruel. The air in my lungs changed when I read it. Incapacity, certificate, transfer. There it was, a scheme moving like a slow umbrella toward my life. I folded the paper into a small square and put it into the false bottom of my suitcase. I felt no anger at first, only the sharp, clear precision that comes before a storm. The kind of clarity you get when you have been awake for 3 nights and the world is finally simple. Micro cliffhanger. I found more than a paper. I started my reconnaissance with the small cunning of a woman who had once run a household like a ship. I made friends with the registrar at Harrow and Finch, not by charm, but by a memory they could not resist. I told the receptionist I was a client's mother, that I had come to collect my daughter for an appointment I had suspected was scheduled by mistake. I let my voice be the voice of a woman who did not ask for much. The receptionist, surprised by my insistence, gave me an appointment to review documents for November 30th at 11:00 a.m. An odd courtesy, perhaps for someone who was not technically their client. I thanked her and kept my heart steady. When I sat in Mr. Finch's office, his books looked like a small forest of law. Marcus Finch offered me coffee and a chair and the kind of smile that tells you he has already mapped your fate. "Mrs. Langley," he said, and there was a rustle when he pulled papers from a manila folder. He produced copies of a durable power of attorney dated September 12, 2024, which listed my daughter Claire as agent with broad powers to manage my finances, bank accounts, and real estate interests. The document bore a notary stamp, Helen Grady, Notary Public, notarized September 12, 2024. It also included a trust amendment dated October 1, 2024, in which a clause was inserted regarding personal effects to be transferred to J. Redding, trustee upon the demonstration of incapacity as certified by a licensed medical practitioner. The amendment was neat, clinical, and poisonous in its simplicity. Mr. Finch watched me for a reaction. "Your daughter signed voluntarily, Mrs. Langley," he said. "You even initialed a line about financial planning. We follow protocol." He slid a paper toward me, a form that they said bore my initials next to a checkbox about durable power of attorney. The ink was a dark blue that gleamed under the light, like the sea in a photograph you know is staged. I pretended to be confused and asked for time to think. He smiled with the patience of someone who believed in the tide. I left with copies and a hollow feeling. There is a way that paper thins a person, like eroding soil. The mason jar on my shelf seemed to rattle. Micro cliffhanger. The notary stamp smelled of someone else's hands. Back at the house, I waited until the drawing room laughter became a dull background hum, and then I went to work with the tenderness of someone untying knots. I compared the signatures on the copies with a letter I had written in 1998, a letter that had never known the need to be forged. My signature then was a specific thing. The curl of the L was wide. The G in my surname dipped like a river. On the copies, the L was tighter, hasty, and the G snapped like a line cut by scissor. I traced the lines with my finger until the paper warmed beneath my skin. I have a terrible memory for faces, but a stubborn memory for the way my hand moves across a page. Something did not fit. Rosa was my braver shadow. She began to bring me small things, a sticky note with file J. Redding, finalize 1112 scribbled across it, a discarded printout with an email header, a business card for Crimson Advisors that bore J. Redding's name. Each scrap said the same thing. This was not the accident of family. It was a plan. The coalition against me had names, rooms, and appendices. Micro cliffhanger. Someone was building a map of me. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, the chipped mug warming my hands, and I made a list. I write better lists than most people. Lists are the economy of my life. On November 5, 2024, the durable power of attorney had been entered into their files. On October 1, 2024, the trust amendment had been added. On November 12th, J. Redding had emailed the lawyer. The townhouse equity was listed at about $85,000. The retirement fund approximately $230,000. The family home appraised at $480,000, numbers that to others are cold and dry, but to me were the history of a life measured in bricks and soup spoons. The legalese around personal effects had the potential to swallow everything, the pearls, the chipped mug, the little portraits and letters that make a life more than value on a sheet. Then came my quiet coup. I knew the house in the way one knows the roots of old pain. I knew its servants' rhythms, the time when the study door would be unlatched for deliveries. Rosa told me Mr. Redding usually stayed until late, and that sometimes he left documents on the side table to be filed later. On December 1st, while the household simmered in holiday plans, I walked into the study and found a folder, not hidden, but placed like an unguarded thing. Within it were copies of emails, a draft of the trust amendment with tracked changes, and a document that made my hand go cold, a letter of instruction from J. Redding to Marcus Finch recommending procedures to be followed in the event of incapacity. It was addressed simply, "For immediate action, micro cliffhanger." The letter said what they planned to do next. I took the folder like one takes a small, illicit blessing. The paper rustled in my bag. I had to move carefully because one wrong breath, and the house would know. I stayed out of sight until the kitchen clock chimed midnight, and the home settled into the soft world of people who believe the night will keep their secrets. Then, on the evening of December 2nd at 9:17 p.m., I heard the voice that would change everything. It came from the terrace where my daughter often took calls, the place where she went to present a world to people who applauded her at board meetings. She was speaking to someone in low, quick sentences. "I have the files," she said. Harrow and Finch stamped them. "The durable power will go through. Jay will be the trustee for personal effects. Now we just need the certificate. Dr. Larkin will sign it as soon as he sees her." There was a pause, a short set of measured breaths. "Yes, we will do the medical evaluation on December 6th. Yes, the affidavit will be ready." It is a strange thing to hear your child speak of you as if you were an animal to be administered. I pressed my lips until they hurt and stepped closer, listening for a detail that would not permit deniability. She said, "He's already arranged for the form. We only need a window when she might falter." Then a softer, almost tender note. "It's just the paperwork. It's efficient." I could have walked into the terrace then and confronted her. I could have knocked and set everything ablaze with my fury. But a different flame burned in me then. The flame of a woman who has lived long enough to know how to wait to strike. Instead, I did what old women sometimes do when they cannot yet call the law. I recorded. I had a small voice recorder in the lining of my handbag, a little thing I used for poems and the occasional grocery list. I pressed record and tucked the device under a potted fern. For 24 minutes, I listened as my daughter laid out the steps to make the person she claims to love into someone who could legally be declared incapable. Micro cliffhanger, I recorded the plan. Dumas liked to remind his readers that vengeance is a patient God. Let us be frank, patience is a kind of virtue and a kind of weapon. I stepped from the shadow and into the corridor when the call ended, clutching the recorder as if it were a stone that might sink. My heart kept time with the sound of my own breath. The recorder was small, but in its memory lay the voice of my child explaining the mechanics of my erasure. I took the recording to Mr. Alvarez, a retired attorney who lived 2 blocks away and gardened roses like memorials. He had once defended a neighbor for a theft he did not commit, and in doing so taught me that the law has a pulse, sometimes slow, sometimes quick. Mr. Alvarez played the recording with a frown that deepened as the minutes unfurled. "This," he said at last, "reads like conspiracy. A talk of certificates and coordination with a doctor. It's not just family economics. It's manufacture. I felt the decision come to me like a tide. There was a line that, once crossed, leaves you no path back. That line for me was not a legal one, but an ethical one. If they intended to make me a problem to be processed, then I would become a woman who processed them right back." Mr. Alvarez, blunt, efficient, and slow to astonishment, said he would make inquiries. He recommended we get a handwriting expert to examine the signatures and a forensic accountant to trace transfers. He smiled briefly with the warmth of a man who had seen injustice and decided to do something about it. Mid-turn moral aside, there are moments when a woman's silence becomes a conspiracy. There are moments when a woman's voice becomes her only weapon. Injustice loves the comfortable. It fears the inconvenient truth. We set a plan, have the recording authenticated, secure the copies of documents I had salvaged, and prepare to place an injunction once we had proof that a forged document had been filed. I felt for the first time since arriving a fierce clarity. It is a queer relief to feel your own pulse quicken with purpose instead of fear. But plots have currents outside our control. On December 4th at 3:03 p.m., a courier arrived with a thick envelope for me. My hand shook as I slid it with the letter opener I keep for such moments. Inside was a certificate of temporary incapacity, bearing the heading of the local probate court and a physician's signature. Dr. Emil Larkin, signed December 3rd, 2024. 10:22 a.m. The certificate cited medical findings consistent with cognitive impairment and recommended immediate temporary guardianship, appointing Claire Langley as temporary guardian, pending further evaluation. The document bore a seal and an affidavit sworn by a nurse who claimed to have administered an assessment the previous day. My hands went cold. I read the paper 3 times as if the truth might change shape and tell me it had been a mistake. But there it was, formal and legal sounding. The house, with its rooms like stage theater, had managed to get ahead of me. The legal system, the very thing that should protect truth, now had a document that could silence me. The certificate meant that for the next 30 days, my capacity to sign, transfer, or litigate could be constrained pending a hearing. Micro cliffhanger. They had moved faster than I expected. I called Rosa immediately. Her voice when she answered was small and urgent. "They came while I was sweeping, ma'am," she said. "A man from the clinic, a nurse. They asked if you were available for a routine check, and Dr. Larkin came. He said he would examine you. I told him you were asleep." The sick little detail. She said the nurse had kept a tablet showing a signed consent form purportedly bearing my initials. I thought of the recording folded into Mr. Alvarez's briefcase. I thought of the email copies I had salvaged. I thought of the notary stamp that smelled like someone else's hands. The map they had built now had a detour, and the detour was a legal instrument that could stop time. I felt my spine like an old hinge being oiled by a new resolve. I drove to the probate clerk's office with Mr. Alvarez at my side, the recorder's weight heavy in my bag. The clerk was polite but brisk. The file was open and waiting. The entry listed the certificate of temporary incapacity filed on December 3rd at 4:01 p.m. The time on the stamped envelope I had received earlier matched that entry. Mr. Alvarez's jaw tightened when he read the nurse's affidavit. Patient consented to evaluation on 12/3/2024 at 10 a.m. The clerk said, "There is a hearing scheduled in 10 days to determine whether temporary guardianship should be made permanent." I could have wept. Instead, I felt something colder and brighter, the clarity of a woman who knows she has been almost erased and decides to fight the erasure with every tool she can find. I remembered the mason jar. I remembered the pearls. They were not things to be measured in a courtroom, but I would use the law to retrieve what the law had allowed them to take. Before the hearing, we had to prove the documents were not only improper, but falsified. The signature on the durable power, the timing of the medical certificate, the nurse's affidavit. Mr. Alvarez set out like a general. He had contacts at Harrow and Finch and a forensic document examiner who owed him a debt for a favor years ago. We would subpoena not only the documents, but also the communications between J. Redding and Mr. Finch. We would present the recording as well. But for the first time, I felt the house, which had seemed so powerful, like a glass bell jar that was beginning to crack. Pre-confrontation moral aside, a family is a theater where every kindness may hide a currency note. When kindness is withdrawn and stamped, it is no longer love but a ledger. I made my next move carefully. On December 5th, I returned to the house under the pretense of packing a few things for what might be a long stay in a more supervised setting. I went into the study, where the air smelled of lemon polish and quiet deals, and opened the drawer where I had once found that first letter. There, behind a stack of envelopes, lay an unsealed envelope with my name scrawled in a hasty hand. It contained a photograph, not of me, but of the signature sheet of the durable power of attorney. In the corner, someone had written, "Copy, J. Keep." The handwriting was not my daughter's and not J. Redding's. It was someone's shorthand. I tucked the photograph into my brooch and slipped into the corridor. That night, I prepared for the hearing with a peculiar kind of calm. I had the recording authenticated by Mr. Alvarez's friend. It was dated and sealed. The forensic examiner had examined the signatures and agreed, preliminarily, that the ink in the durable power didn't match the ink on my known documents and that the pattern of pressure in the strokes was inconsistent with my long-established hand. These were technical things, but they were real. We had a path. Then, while I was arranging the little things that make a woman feel armored, the pearls around my neck like a small promise, my daughter came into my room as if by chance. She sat on the edge of the bed that night, the lamplight soft and the shadows long. She spoke gently as if speaking to a child. "Mother," she said, "this is hard on everyone. We only want what is best for you. There are procedures to protect you." Her voice was the careful dulcimer of someone steering a ship. I watched her hands. They were not the hands that once needed help with coats and shoelaces. I could have told her then that I had the recording, that I had the email copies, that I had a retired lawyer and a mason jar of coins. I could have told her that everything she had done had a sound. Instead, I did what a good conductor does. I let the orchestra swell and watched the players reveal themselves. "If what you say is true," I said, Then everything here will be clarified at the hearing. Let the law speak. My voice was small but steady. She nodded as if that were a reasonable response. That's all we ask, she said. At 8:32 the next morning, I received a phone call that made my fingers freeze around the receiver. It was a voice I did not know, but that had the authority of consequence. Mrs. Langley? The woman said. This is Helena Price, probate investigator. I need to speak with you regarding recent filings. There are some discrepancies. I repeated the word in my mind. Discrepancies. There is an odd courage that comes with being recognized by someone who is meant to protect truth. I told her I had evidence and that I would meet her at the courthouse. It felt, briefly, as if the stars had lined up to help an old woman who had kept her dignity in a chipped mug. Then, just as I rose to leave, the knock came. It was a single knock at my door that sounded like someone tapping at a coffin. I opened the door to find a man in a suit holding a letter. He said, Mrs. Langley, I am sorry to disturb you. There's been a filing. A counter-affidavit has been filed by Dr. Emil Larkin. He insists the evaluation stands. His voice was steady. His face was as blank as the form he extended. I took the paper without looking at it first. The nurse's signature had been matched with a stamped statement. The certificate seemed fortified by a second physician's note attesting to the initial evaluation. It was an escalation, professional and quick. Someone had moved faster than we anticipated. They were always one step ahead. I pressed my lips into a thin line and felt the old resolve gather. If they thought paper would silence me, they had not met the sort of woman who brood and then strike. I had the recording, the copies, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had left a trail. Mr. Alvarez called his contacts. Mr. Finch returned my call with the cool civility of a man who believes in the superiority of process. Claire, when I saw her later that day, smiled with a calm that did not reach her eyes. I had made my decision the moment I pressed record. I would not be a passive ledger entry in their accounting. I would not be erased by a certificate that smelled faintly of hurried ink and a hurried conscience. I would fight, and I would use the law to do it. I think Dumas understood that revenge, or justice dressed as revenge, requires both patience and the will to be implacable. Then, as if the opera reached its loudest brass, as if the curtains would now begin their final fall toward confrontation, I found an email in the discarded printer tray, a printout that someone in a hurry had tossed. It was from J. Redding to Claire. We will proceed with filing the certificate on 12/3. Once temporary guardianship is in place, we proceed with transfer to the Crimson, trust and disbursement as previously agreed. Those last words were like the final straw, as previously. Agreed. A neat confirmation that this was not a misstep, but a full plan, I felt at that moment. The change that Dumas wrote about so well. A woman once content to be the background, now in the foreground with the knowledge of the play. The turning point was not a sword, but a recording, not a duel, but a document, and the weapon was the truth. Pre-climax moral aside, a single truth, when wrapped in patience, becomes a sword. The fiercest justice is not the cruelest, but the one that clears the table and shows the ledger to the light. I walked to my mirror that night and adjusted the pearls. They felt heavy, and then, like a promise, lighter for being worn. I thought of my husband's hands and the way he once said, "Keep your coins, keep your stories. Both feed you in winter." I had coins, stories, and now a plan. On the morning we were to file for an injunction, I sat in Mr. Alvarez's office, the recording sealed in evidence and the copies lined like soldiers on the table. We had enough to ask the court for an emergency stay on the certificate of temporary incapacity until we could present our evidence. The legal clock ticked fast, and the House's machinery moved with polished speed. Mr. Alvarez outlined the strategy: authenticate recording, subpoena Harrow and Finch, and call Dr. Larkin as a witness. As we left the office with our papers, the phone rang. Mr. Alvarez answered. Yes, a pause. When? Another pause. He turned to me, his mouth a thin line. Mrs. Langley, he said softly, there's been a development. The probate clerk just called. There's a supplemental filing, a sworn affidavit that claims you were found disoriented on the evening of 12/2 and 2 medical professionals attested you were not competent to manage your affairs. They filed it at 9:45 a.m. The clerk says it's been logged. My breath left me. I felt the fragile certainty of our plan wobble. Then the final, small sound, a knock on the office. Door that made the hairs on my arms lift like a winter wind. I reached for the recorder in my bag, and fingers that had once crocheted baby blankets now held a tiny device that contained the voice of my child plotting to take my life into paper and pounds. I had decided to fight. I pressed my thumb to the recorder and hit play. The recorder clicked like a small, honest heart, and then my daughter's voice spilled into the room in bright, cruel clarity. We will proceed with filing the certificate on 12/3. Once temporary guardianship is in place, we proceed with transfer to the Crimson Trust and disbursement as previously agreed. Her sentences were a ledger and a lullaby at once. Clinical, comforting to her, murderous to me. When Mr. Alvarez pressed play in his office and the voice filled the hush, something inside me unclenched and then tightened into a decision. The recorder was no longer a petty thing to be hidden in a handbag. It had become the most accurate mirror of the house's intentions. Mr. Alvarez nodded once, the way a captain nods before he sees his plan through. "We'll file these as evidence," he said. "We will subpoena Harrow and Finch. We will bring Dr. Larkin and Jay Redding into the light." I felt like a woman learning, late and stubbornly, how to wear armor. My pearls felt heavier that morning, not with burden, but with the gravity of someone who has decided to keep her story. Rosa stood at the kitchen doorway, her palms raw from work, and her eyes said what she could not voice. "I am with you." I tucked the small recorder into the false bottom of my suitcase, as if burying a small flame to be relit in the courtroom. Micro cliffhanger. The recorder would be my sword. The hearing on December 13th, 2024, was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Probate Courtroom 4, an unremarkable room with a flag that looked like an afterthought and chairs too large for the elderly. News of the filing had reached the local paper. Someone had an eye for a drama where silver served. The room's blinds were drawn like eyes half closed, waiting for the reveal. My daughter sat to my right with an expression like a woman who believes her costume is the truth. Across the aisle, lawyers in black murmured into their pens, and the gallery smelled of perfume and the faint odor of anticipation. Mr. Alvarez presented our evidence with the economy of a man who has practiced persuading people with paper. First, the authenticated recording. Second, the copies. The durable power of attorney dated September 12th. The trust amendment of October 1st with the personal effects clause. The email printouts from Jay Redding dated November 12th. And the discarded printout from the printer tray that read, plainly, "We will proceed with filing the certificate on 12/3. He explained the chain: Harrow and Finch, Jay Redding of Crimson Advisors, Dr. Emil Larkin, a nurse's affidavit. He displayed the notary stamp: Helen Grady, Notary Public, notarized September 12, 2024, and then the place of execution entry, the judge. A woman of a stern mouth and soft eyes leaned forward. "Ms. Langley," she said, addressing my daughter as if to test the air, "how do you respond to the assertion that these documents and the certificate were coordinated to transfer Mrs. Langley's personal effects and control to a third party?" The room sharpened like a knife. Claire answered with the cool steadiness she had used when she invited me for Thanksgiving, the politeness that had the texture of a velvet glove. "These documents were executed to protect my mother's interests," she said. "Dr. Larkin's evaluation was professional. We only sought what was best for her." Her voice held the practiced cadence of someone who negotiates for a living. I felt the old ache, the one that remembers bandaged knees, and then a brighter, more dangerous feeling. I would not be spoken for. We called experts. The forensic document examiner, Ms. Evelyn Park, inspected the durable power of attorney and the advance directive, and then compared them with my letters and bank signatures dating back to 1990. She showed the court magnified images of strokes and pressure, the ink's composition, and the rhythm of the hand. "There are inconsistencies," she said plainly. "The pressure pattern and ink flow on the durable power indicate a different hand and possibly a different pen. The alleged initials that Mrs. Langley gave appear mechanically placed. It looks like simulation. Then Mr. Alvarez played the recording. My daughter's voice, my child's voice, explaining the plan arced through the room. She began to argue, to explain, to say it had been misinterpreted, but the judge had heard the clear step-by-step language: certificate, guardianship, transfer. My daughter's counsel attempted to discredit the recording, suggesting it had been edited or taken out of context. The court allowed cross-examination and ordered it authenticated by an independent lab. The lab confirmed that the recording was unedited and contained the natural cadence of my daughter's speech. The air in courtroom 4 changed. It was no longer simply a family dispute. The matter had become one of procedure and potential criminality. Micro cliffhanger. The courtroom held its breath. We then called Dr. Emil Larkin. He had been the pivot upon which they expected to swing the gavel. He was a man with a mild face and the stethoscope of someone used to measuring safety. I watched him approach the witness box with an expression that did not know why his hands trembled. Mr. Alvarez asked him about the evaluation on December 3rd. The doctor spoke of assessments and tests, of cognitive scales and checklists. When Mr. Alvarez presented our evidence, the recorded conversation where Claire spoke of scheduling the certificate and of coordinating with Dr. Larkin for a certificate, the doctor's brow folded. "I recall a visit," he said slowly. "But my records show a different date for the evaluation." Mr. Alvarez pressed further. "Do you recall receiving compensation from Crimson Advisors or from any party associated with the Langley estate?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear the clock behind the bench tick. The doctor's voice broke, and then, in a sound that was like the crack of a fragile shell, he said, "I accepted payment." It was for a consultation. I did not know they would use my name on a certificate without my full report. There was a stuttering of excuses, fatigue, paperwork, misunderstanding. But the truth had a way of slipping out in such moments. Under the judge's questioning and the presentation of bank transfers showing a payment to Dr. Larkin from an account linked to Crimson Advisors on December 2nd, he conceded. His process had been rushed, and the certificate had been issued with incomplete evaluation notes. It was as if the house's clock had suddenly been wound back and the false time revealed. Micro cliffhanger. The doctor's concession was like a crack in a dam. Then came Rosa's testimony. She sat on a chair in the witness area, and when she spoke it was with the unvarnished clarity of someone who has cleaned rooms and seen secrets in the folds of curtains. She told the court about Mr. Redding's visits, about folders left on the study table, about a nurse who had come early one morning and a form that bore my initials. She spoke of the time she had printed an email at the request of Mr. Redding and of how she had slipped me a copy because she could not bear the look in my daughter's eyes that day. Her voice was small, but it landed like stones being placed in a foundation. Then Mr. Alvarez produced the most damning evidence. The email chain showing coordinated communications between J. Redding and Marcus Finch at Harrow and Finch, emails dated November 12th and November 28th, with subject lines like finalize personal effects transfer and coordinate certificate window. The court watched pixel for pixel as the plan unfolded not as a misjudgment, but as a plot. When the judge looked at Claire, there was a thin sadness, not theatrical but measured, like the last clear note of a long song. I felt an odd detachment then, like a woman watching someone else's life from across a room. But that detachment was a winter nerve that sharpened my attention. The evidence piled like clean plates on a table. The durable power of attorney might have been a legal document, but with the forged initials and the hasty notary, it had become a tool in a larger theft. The judge took a long moment, then issued a temporary restraining order reversing the certificate of temporary incapacity issued on December 3rd, 2024, and scheduled an evidentiary hearing for a full review. She ordered an immediate freeze on transfers to the Crimson Trust, pending forensic accounting of any transfers since October 1st, 2024. This probate clerk confirmed in open court that the trust amendment and durable power would be placed under review and that Helen Grady, the notary, would be investigated for potential misconduct. Marcus Finch's firm, Harrow and Finch, would be required to produce all communications with Crimson advisors and to explain why the amendment had been accepted without independent verification. Micro cliffhanger. The judge's ruling felt like thunder. In the days that followed, the House's polished surfaces lost some of their shine. The Gala Committee postponed their floral arrangements, and the charitable board requested an audit. Claire's speeches were cancelled, and an article in the local paper, careful, sober, and precise, mentioned the ongoing investigation. J. Redding's office at Crimson Advisors, when served with a subpoena, filed a response that read like someone trying to close a door while admitting there had been a hallway of rooms behind it. I watched all of this like someone who has once set a pot on a stove and then raises the lid to check. The steam told me more than the ingredients. The criminal investigator assigned to the potential forgery case called within a week. He was thorough and not unkind. He asked me softly about motive, about relationships, and whether I felt threatened. I told him simply that a woman who keeps a mason jar and pearls is unlikely to care for wealth beyond the dignity it affords her. The investigator took my statement and then, with a practical calm, said, "We will look into the forgeries and any improper influence on medical professionals." He noted the bank transfers and requested financial records. It was the recognition of what I already knew. Paper can be weaponized, and sometimes the law must be used to unarm it. There was a finalness to the weeks that followed, a time when the House's orchestra began to pack its instruments. Claire, once so composed, was sometimes seen alone in the garden, hands at her face. The board members of the charities she chaired sent letters of concern. Marcus Finch's firm placed a statement on their letterhead about procedural reviews and internal audits. Crimson Advisors issued a terse press release saying they would cooperate fully. J. Redding, once pleasant in a slick suit, stopped coming to the House. When he did, he was questioned at the courthouse under subpoena, and his explanations were thin. The email chain and the bank transfers spoke in a language he could not veto. And yet, for all this public unraveling, the thing I wanted most was not revenge tallied in headlines, but the return of my life. I wanted the pears on the windowsill and the chipped mug to be more than symbols. I wanted to know that the masonry of a life I had built with small kindnesses would be recognized again as a home and not as an asset. Pre-final confrontation moral aside, the law is a lamp. Often it is dim, but it will reveal what darkness cannot hide. When a child bars the door against a parent, remember, blood is no guarantee of mercy. The final hearing, held in Probate Courtroom 1 on January 7, 2025, began at 9:30 a.m. The room was fuller than before, perhaps because the case had become more than a private quarrel. It had become a lesson about the currency of kindness. Mr. Alvarez presented our compiled forensic report. The handwriting expert confirmed that the initials on the durable power had a pressure pattern inconsistent with my long-established signature. The forensic accountant traced a transfer of approximately $40,000 from an account associated with my assets to a Crimson Advisors escrow account on December 2, 2024. And emails demonstrated a coordinated plan with dates and times matching the recordings. Dr. Larkin, under cross-examination, admitted that he had been paid $150 for a consultation and that his office had not documented a full neuropsychological assessment prior to issuing the certificate of temporary incapacity. When the judge read her findings, that there was probable cause to believe the certificate and associated documents were obtained by undue influence and perhaps forged, there was a hush like a congregation waiting for benediction. She ordered the trust amendment to be voided pending further review and ordered restitution. Any funds transferred to Crimson Advisors from the Langley estate accounts between October 1, 2024 and December 31, 2024 were to be frozen and returned pending the outcome of civil proceedings. She referred the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges, including forgery and fraud. Claire stood then, and for the first time looked truly small. Perhaps she saw in my face not only the woman who had raised her, but the woman whom the law now recognized as wronged. She stepped forward and said, voice thin and raw, "Mother, I thought I was making the right choice. I thought I was protecting you." There was a sincerity in that confession, but the damage was not undone by the honesty of regret. The judge allowed a moment for the private exchange, but made clear that honesty could not retroactively unmake the legal wrongs. Micro cliffhanger. Her apology sounded like a door closing. There was another kind of reckoning that morning that the court could not legislate, but which felt, to me, like the sweetest part of justice. When Claire's employer, the philanthropic board, read the judge's findings, they convened an emergency meeting. They reviewed her conduct and asked for an accounting. She was asked to step back from her positions pending the outcome. Marcus Finch and Jay Redding faced professional censure and the prospect of malpractice suits and criminal charges. Helen Grady, the notary, faced a suspension of her commission pending investigation. But the most human and perhaps most satisfying consequence was not the legal one. It was the small return of neighborly support. Friends I had thought long since gone called and asked if I needed help. A church group sent a basket of soup. Rosa, who had been my small and brave ally, received a letter from a temp agency offering her full-time work. Mr. Alvarez, who had told me legal battles are like gardens, they need tending, smiled and said, "You see, Mrs. Langley, we have the law. Now it will do for you what it failed to do for others." And then came the day of settlement. The probate court approved a civil settlement in which the contested transfers were returned, the trust amendment voided, and provisions made to ensure the preservation of personal effects, including my pearls and the items listed specifically as personal belongings of Mary Langley, to be held in trust under an independent fiduciary pending final disposition. The legal documents use the language of lawyers, which is to say, meticulous, slow, and cold, but within that coldness was fairness. Claire was ordered to pay restitution for legal fees and to undergo mediation with me to discuss family matters and boundaries. The district attorney's office opened an inquiry into the potential criminality of the forged documents. Poetic justice arrived in small, human ways afterward. Claire lost some of her positions and the glossy lectures she gave. She was not imprisoned. I did not seek that hammer. What I sought was a restoration of dignity. The courthouse had done that. It had also, as the law does, required careful proof. We had given it that proof by gathering papers and voices and truth. In one of our mediated sessions, a room with folding chairs and a vase of tulips placed like a small apology, my daughter sat across from me and took my hands. Her fingers were the same fingers that once held my face when I cried at lost jobs and broken promises. She whispered, "I am sorry." There was a raw honesty there that required a response more generous than triumph. I thought of the man I had once loved and the small vows we made, to feed, to shelter, to forgive when possible. I forgave her because forgiveness is a work that feeds the giver more than the receiver. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting. She would have to rebuild trust the same way one rebuilds a house, beam by beam. The legal ruling had given me the space to reclaim my home and my life. The rest would be a careful daily work. The mason jar returned to its place on the kitchen shelf, and when I poured its coins into my palm, they felt like the small medals of a life well guarded. The pearls rested again around my throat, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Dignity, once trampled, can be reclaimed by steady, persistent hands. I bought a new chipped mug from a little pottery shop. The old one had gone for cleaning, and I decided a new mug might carry new stories. I held it and felt the weight of water and warmth and the simple domestic joy of being trusted to make my own tea. There is one moment I will carry forever. After the settlement, Claire came to me, not in boardroom clothes, but in a sweater I once knitted for her when she was small. She offered me a single thing I had not asked for, a letter. She had written it in the quietness after the hearings, and her handwriting was shakier than it had been when she wrote invoices and proposals. "Mother," she wrote, "I have been cruel. I let my fear of loss become a theft of your agency. I am ashamed." She asked for forgiveness and for work to earn back a place beside me, not as a benefactor, but as a daughter. That letter, tucked into my pocket like an offering, felt more valuable to me than any docket slip. Resolution arrived not as a trumpet, but as a slow, domestic dawn. The house, which had felt like a stage for so long, began to feel like a home again. I moved my favorite chair to the window, where the light fell in the way it had when I was young and the days were full of small labors. I began to write again. Not invoices, but letters, recipes, and the little notes I had once used to bridge arguments. I made soup and invited neighbors. The board that had once admired my daughter's professional polish called to ask her to testify on governance reforms. She accepted and began, publicly and privately, to rebuild. There was a humility in that process that felt like a return to the human. I have been asked, often since this ordeal, whether I felt betrayed. Yes, I did. It is possible to feel betrayal in your bones and still choose a moral path. I have been asked whether I felt triumphant. Not in the way triumphant is pictured in novels. My triumph was quieter. A restored signature, a returned bank balance, my pearls clasped at my throat. The true justice was not always in the courtroom. Sometimes it was the neighbor who brought soup and stayed to stitch a hem. Final moral reflection. Dumas would nod. Betrayal, like winter, reveals the hollows in a house and the strength of what remains. Let no one imagine that family is a bank. Family is a covenant. When covenants are broken, call the law, call your friends, and call your courage. If my story touched you, if you have a grandmother, a parent, or a friend whose voice has been softened by others, share this tale. Let it be a small armor for someone who thinks they are alone. Subscribe for more stories of small people who make great decisions and tell someone you love them before the world tries to decide for them. And if you ever find a mason jar hiding the last coins of a life, remember this. Treat it kindly, for it is the testament of 1,000 little mercies.